Okay, good morning. My name is Maya Tarashvili. I'm the Deputy Director of the Eurasia Program here at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. And today we will be talking about Russia's war in Ukraine. As most of you know, 3 days ago, we marked a 1-year anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And this war still rages on a year later. So today I'm joined by 3 of my colleagues to discuss this war, what we've learned from it, and what it has taught us about what might be coming in terms of Ukraine's future, the future of European security and the transatlantic alliance, and of course, in terms of Russia's role in the world and Russia's relationship with the West. So I'm joined by Robert Hamilton, who is a senior fellow at FPRI in our Eurasia program. I'm also joined by John Denny, who is a research professor of security studies at the U.S. Army War College's Strategic Studies Institute. And I'm joined by Phil Vasilevsky, who is a senior fellow at FPRI's Eurasia program. Also, their longer bios are available on our website and in this event description for which you've registered. Of course, as always, I would like to keep this conversational. I would like to give our audience members a chance to ask as many questions as possible. I'll get to your questions as soon as they start coming in. So please feel free to use the Q&A feature on your screen to send in your questions, and I'll get to them as soon as I can. With that, I will turn it over to Bob. So we don't have any prepared remarks. It's just going to be a lot of questions coming your way, guys. So I will start with Bob. So a year ago, when Russia started bombing Kyiv, most experts had anticipated that it would be a 48-hour war, that Kyiv would fall within 48 hours. It seemed like even, Ukraine's Western allies were prepared to give the Ukrainian government shelter. But obviously the war went on. It still goes on. What would you say were some of the main reasons that, one, we sort of underestimated how well Kyiv would do, but two, the reason why this war has lasted so long?
So, yeah, thank you, Maya. So short answer, I would say why we're still fighting, or the Ukrainians and Russians are still fighting after a year, is Ukraine was more capable and Russia was much less capable than we thought. But I'll put a little meat on those bones. So first of all, from the Russian side, I think it's clear now that the plan was based on invalid assumptions that bordered on magical thinking. In other words, the Russians really appeared to believe that they could pull off something approaching Crimea 2014 on a national scale, that they could move in quickly with a fairly small force, that the Ukrainian military wouldn't fight back too hard, that they could seize key nodes of command and control, strategic importance, and the country would sort of fall apart, and much of the Ukrainian military would come over to the Russian side. Now, maybe we can get into the Q&A to how they were able to convince themselves that this was a likely outcome. But nevertheless, it's pretty clear that that was the most common sort of thinking in the Kremlin in terms of how this would go. There didn't appear to be any what we call in the military branch or sequel planning going on. In other words, if the assumptions upon which your base plan is based are invalid, you have to have sequel or branch plans. You have to have modifications of your plan that allow you to deal with the fact that some of your initial planning assumptions didn't pan out. There didn't appear to be any of that type of planning that went on in the Russian military plan. I think here it's important to say it's pretty clear that the general staff did not lead this planning effort. Yes, the Russian military is deeply flawed, but the Russian general staff is pretty good at strategic and operational planning. And had the general staff come up with this plan and presented it to the Kremlin, I think it's fairly clear that we would have seen a different war. What I think happened is the Kremlin came up with a plan and presented it to the general staff, and then the Russian military executed a plan that probably you would have seen many more than 190,000 Russian troops had the general staff come up with this plan in the initial invasion. And then the final thing on the Russian side, I think, is you see a very rigid, hierarchical, fear-based leadership and command and control system. So there was no ability for smaller units, junior leaders, to seize and exploit opportunities. So when any sort of combat is a very dynamic undertaking. Things happen that you don't expect, right? And often what the high command sees is not what units in the field see. And in Western militaries, and apparently in the Ukrainian military, which I think surprised a lot of people early on in the war, junior leaders were able to see and exploit those opportunities. In the Russian military, it did appear that junior leaders would see opportunities, but weren't able to exploit them because they had to stop and wait for permission to take what was an obvious next step if you're a well-trained military leader. So on the Russian side, I think that's what we saw. On the Ukrainian side, first, I think it's worth noting that the stakes were existential for Ukraine, and it was clear very early in the war that this was a war for the continued existence or the end of the existence of the Ukraine as an independent state and the Ukrainian people as a nation separate from Russia. The next thing you have on the Ukrainian side, I think, is inspirational leadership all the way from President Zelensky down. We have to be careful not to over romanticize Ukraine's effort, but nevertheless, there were some moments that were incredibly inspirational. The video, I think, on the second day of the war, when they're standing outside the presidential administration, he's got his whole team with him and said, "We're all still here." The response to the U.S. offer to get Zelensky out of the country, "I need ammunition, not a ride," right? It was really sort of inspirational. Not only convinced Ukraine's Western partners that the Ukrainians could and would fight this, but that I think it was inspirational for the Ukrainian military and Ukrainian people. The next thing on the Ukrainian side is, I think, Western military aid and training before the war had a not insignificant effect. I wouldn't say it was a game changer, because a few hundred javelins, if they're not used properly, are not going to turn the tide of the war in the first 48 hours. But the Ukrainians were well trained on them, and they were able to use them in a dispersed manner where, again, in contrast to the Russians, junior Ukrainian leaders, small teams using javelins, were able to go out and shoot Russian tanks without having to call up several levels of the chain of command to ask permission. So the Ukrainians had a flexibility and a dynamism, I think, that was absent in the Russians. And part of that, I think, was due to Western training that really started in 2014 after the seizure of Crimea. And then the final thing is, as the war went on and Ukraine sort of survived the initial shock of the Russian assault and showed that it was going to be able to fight back and fight back effectively, you see an increasing appetite for risk on the part of Ukraine's Western partners and an increasing appetite to provide more capable equipment that takes longer to train Ukrainians on and is a more valuable asset if it were to fall into Russian hands. But as Western countries begin to believe that the Ukrainians are in this for the long haul, that they have shown that they're going to fight back and are able to reverse some of the initial Russian gains, you see the West willing and able to provide more capable weaponry to the Ukrainians, which then increases their ability to go back in the counteroffensive. So I would say those are the basic reasons why a year in we're still fighting.
Thank you so much, Bob. So a follow-up question to that is probably the worst question I could ask, which I have saved for Phil. But Phil, I feel like you're one of the best people I can go to with this question, which is, likely outcomes of this war. Again, a horrible question, but you actually wrote 6 weeks into the war back in April of last year. You wrote a piece where you were for FPRI, which we're sharing with our audience, and you were sort of examining the likely strategic outcomes of this war. A year in, how have your assumptions changed? And, for example, we've heard from President Zelensky that he believes that they can still win this war within this year. Do you agree with that? What do you see ahead when you think about this war?
Well, Maya, in preparation for the podcast, I reread what I wrote back in April and then later on in June regarding the war. And I have to say, my prognosis has really not changed that much. At the time I estimated that the Ukrainian strategy was going to be to exhaust Russia's offensive potential and to wait for it to collapse, either on the battlefield or politically at home. And Russia, after the retreat from Kyiv, was going to rejigger its strategy, and I predicted it would try three things. First was to pulverize the cities like it did for Grozny and Aleppo to destroy domestic will, occupy Donetsk, Kherson, and Luhansk Oblast in their entirety, and then also continue its efforts to seize Mariupol to create an uninterrupted land bridge from Russia proper to Crimea. I think that's pretty much how it played out and how it's still playing out. I posited in my article 5 scenarios for possible future. Today, I see is only 3 of those scenarios really possible, but I'll really quickly cover the 5 and what I said then and what I believe is possible now. The first scenario was a Russian victory, which would be defined as Ukraine recognizes the illegal annexation of Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk Oblast, as well as the other territory that Russia has seized in this current war, agrees never to join NATO, the EU, other Western institutions, agrees to limit the size of its army. Obviously, the Zelensky government would have to go and a puppet would be put in. In other words, Ukraine becomes a vassal of Moscow again. I posited that for this to happen, the Ukrainian military and the Ukrainian nation's will to fight would have to be, crushed. And for that to happen, Russian military effectiveness would have to drastically improve compared to what they had been doing to date. I also said that this assumes that the Russian political and economic situation back at home stays stable and they're able to support a long, crushing war against Ukraine. So that was the first scenario. And I said then, and I'll say it now, the Russian victory is still possible under those conditions, but so many factors would all have to line up in Russia's favor and Ukraine's disfavor that I don't think it's possibly the most likely scenario. Second option was that Russia declares a victory, goes on the strategic defensive, tries to hold what it has. And I think this was General Surovikin's strategy for the months that he was in charge of the Russian forces in Ukraine. All indications are that this was not agreed upon by the commander-in-chief Putin. He replaced Surovikin, put Gerasimov in charge, and still wants to occupy more Ukrainian territory. And we can cover more about this later on. I think the Russia declaring victory at this point is not one of the options that we may see in the next few months. Ukraine defeating Russia was the third option. And a Ukrainian victory I defined back then was return to the status quo of February 24th without any conditions that violated Ukrainian sovereignty. Since then, Ukrainian war aims have changed to liberation of their entire country back to its legally agreed limits by Russia and the entire world community of 1991. For this to happen back then, and I still say now, you're going to have to see the Russian army decisively defeated on the battlefield or collapse, and also a regime change, or at least a leadership change within the Kremlin itself. In other words, this scenario requires a close repeat of Russian history in 1917. The fourth scenario was a negotiated settlement, which at the time, back in March, if you remember, Zelensky was sending some signals that NATO membership could be on the table for negotiation. He realized NATO was not going to let Ukraine in anytime soon. But the negotiations went nowhere for numerous reasons. It's not that Ukraine rejected peace, as it realized that Russian terms would have meant that it's national annihilation. And once the Russian forces retreated from around Kyiv and Kharkiv, and we uncovered the massive war crimes that had been committed against the Ukrainian people in the occupied areas, negotiated settlement was off the table. And I think it's one of the least likely scenarios in the near term. And the final option I posited, and I'll actually kind of read from what I wrote back then, because I think it's what we're getting close to now is a war of attrition, that this war does not end soon if both countries have the will to continue to fight, which they do at this time, if not for victory, then to avoid defeat. And the front could stabilize, I predicted in April, with Russia's military unable to advance and Ukraine's military unable to dislodge it. Like South Korea and South Vietnam before it, Ukraine therefore becomes the hot focus of a new Cold War. And I concluded back then, and I think this conclusion is still relevant is that a definitive victory for one side is going to require the collapse of the army and domestic political will of the other side. And a long war of attrition, similar to one between Egypt and Israel from, say, 1967 to 1970, is possible. And if there is a peace agreement in the near term, unless that happens, unless there's a definitive victory, it would most likely be reached as a result of mutual exhaustion. And unlikely, it would be an armistice, unlikely to solve anything except provide a rest period before the next war. If there is not a definitive resolution politically that reflects the military situation on the ground, there's no reason to say that we could not have in later years a second or even a third Russian-Ukrainian war.
Bill, thank you so much. And I have quite a few follow-up questions on what you just mentioned. So I'll be turning that back over to Bob and John for their commentary as well. But I want to turn it over to John and pose this question to him. How has this war transformed NATO? And what do you think are some of its most important sort of effects on the EU and European security? How do you see sort of the transatlantic community's role and the way they've supported Ukraine?
Maya, thanks again for the invitation to join you all today. And before I speak, let me note that my views are mine alone and don't reflect those of the U.S. government or the U.S. Army. I think really there are 5 key impacts on NATO and Europe more broadly that I'd like to address. And I'm just going to give you the wave tops. If you'd like, we can dive into the details as follow-ups or during Q&A. 3 of these are at what I would call the geostrategic or geopolitical level, and 2 of them are more at the operational level. Let me start with the geopolitical or strategic. First, clearly, Europe has a new approach to Russia. We see this made manifest most importantly in the energy trade with Russia, but most broadly, Europeans have always thought about their security as having to occur with Russia, right? Not against it. That is really beginning to shift. And I think we have seen evidenced most obviously by the German Zeitenwende, or really change in era, a new era, a sea change we're seeing now in Europe's approach to Russia. This may ultimately result in the demise of what has long been NATO's signature approach to its greatest adversary, and that is the sort of dialogue on the one hand, dialogue and diplomacy with defense. This 2-track approach has animated NATO's its dealings with Russia for decades, and I think we may see the demise of that. The second strategic or geopolitical impact is really in terms of NATO's strategy. It released a new strategic concept last year, and it clearly indicates that collective defense is now the primary mission. Previously, collective defense was one of 3 missions that the alliance pursued, along with cooperative security and crisis response. But now those other missions are all placed in the service of collective defense. That's an important rhetorical change, I think, that we'll see impacts further down the line in terms of how NATO does what it does. And then the third strategic impact is the prospect of enlargement of NATO. We know now that Finland and Sweden have applied for NATO membership. The Hungarians and the Turks are all that stand between them and that membership. This will really allow the alliance to consolidate and improve how it provides security in Northern Europe, especially in the Nordic and Arctic regions. And it represents a significant change in the alignment of these 2 countries, right? Finland being unwilling, really, to have its security arrayed against Russia for decades, since the end of World War II, and Sweden giving up on neutrality, a policy it pursued for the last 200 years. Now, the operational changes, I think, first and foremost, we've seen the alliance shift its force posture in the East. It has decided to expand the battle group, the enhanced forward presence concept, into Southeastern Europe, establishing 4 new units in Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. That's significant. It's increased dramatically its presence in Poland as well as the Baltic states. So this, at the operational level, is a pretty serious shift for the alliance. And then 5th and finally, the nature of the fight as we're seeing. And Bob and Phil both outlined some of these or highlighted some of them. The reliance upon kind of classic use of infantry, armor, and artillery, that is really shaping fundamentally the development of new regional plans that the alliance is putting the finishing touches on. Those will probably be blessed and approved this summer. And it's also fundamentally shaping the NATO defense planning process, the NDPP, the newest iteration of which it's a quadrennial or 4-year process. The newest iteration of that is kicking off this year. So that the war, what it looks like, what's necessary to respond to the Russian threat, that is all going to figure in prominently into the new NDPP, and that is ongoing right now.
John, thank you so much. I want to turn it over to Bob and ask him the same question I asked to Phil in a way. Phil's last point was that this war of attrition is likely. One, do you agree with that? That it will really come down to just this war of attrition, and in that case, there are so many questions. Like, Ukraine is asking for F-15s and F-16s. President Biden is saying Ukraine doesn't need them. Maybe you could explain why that is the case, why Ukraine doesn't need them, so to speak. And if we speak of this war of attrition, does that mean that it's really about the West's capacity to keep on arming Ukraine? So quite a bit to explore there.
Yeah, well, first, let me echo John. Thanks for the reminder, John, by saying that these remarks are my own and don't reflect the policy or position of the Army War College, Army, or the Department of Defense. So I forgot that part up front. Yeah, of course, I do agree with Phil. We're in a sort of a grinding war of attrition stage now. It's going to come down to both military capability and political will on both sides. I think Putin has calculated that at this point, having failed his initial objectives, that his best chance for victory is to wear the West down, not necessarily to wear the Ukrainians down, but to sap the will of the West to continue to provide Ukraine what it needs to win the war. And let me caveat that by saying I don't see a pure military victory as achievable for either side right now, because a military victory would imply that the other side agrees that you have won and stops fighting, right? And even if Russia or Ukraine were to achieve their maximalist aims, even if Russia were somehow to achieve, subjugate all of Ukraine, topple the government, put in a puppet regime, I think it's pretty clear from seeing what's happening in the Russian occupied regions now that Ukraine could fairly easily launch an insurgency that Russia would fail to defeat, especially given the support from over the border, especially from Poland. But an insurgency with sanctuary outside the borders of the state in which it is fought, as many countries have found out in places like Afghanistan and Iraq and other places, it's hard to defeat. It's almost impossible to defeat. So I think even if the Russians were to achieve their maximalist aims, Ukraine would continue to fight. You'd see an insurgency that the Russians probably could never quell. If Ukraine were somehow to recapture or liberate all of the territory inside its internationally recognized borders, Russia has ways to continue the fight. It has capabilities it hasn't yet brought to bear. It has strategic ways to attack strategic targets in Ukraine. And I don't mean just nuclear weapons, but in terms of long-range ballistic missiles, in terms of bombers, that it has not brought fully to bear yet. And it could continue the war without being in Ukraine, right? In a way that may make it almost impossible for Ukraine to stand back up on its feet after liberating its territory. So, yeah, I do think we're in a war of attrition. I'm sort of with Phil. Predicting the future is always hard. But at this stage, I think it's going to come down to not only military capability, but will, and the will of the West is important. I think in Putin's calculus, that's our greatest weakness is the ability to sustain the support for Ukraine over the long term.
So that's where I think this question comes up of, how the US chooses, what we provide Ukraine with, right? So this question of F-15s and F-16s and Ukraine sort of not needing them, whereas the Ukrainian leadership says that they really need it. What's the worry there?
the worry, I think, is that it would expand the war. It would give Ukraine capabilities that, no, so the F-16 is a multi-role fighter. So there's this, I heard someone say recently, well, the Ukrainians don't need them because they don't do ground attack. They do ground attack, right? They do. Their main missions are what you call defensive counter-air, which is fighting other enemy fighters, and then close air support and air interdiction, which is attacking targets on the ground. They're very capable at that. I think the concern on the U.S. side is, first of all, that it's a wait and see approach, which the U.S. has taken for this entire war. You can see that we have gradually upped the type of and capabilities of equipment that we've given the Ukrainians based on two things. One, their demonstrated ability to stay in the war, continue to fight, and actually use the equipment we've already provided effectively. And then two, their use of that equipment in ways that we think is appropriate and not in ways that we think are escalatory, right? So the Ukrainians have done a very good job of using the equipment appropriately and not escalating the war, or not doing things that the US would consider to be overly escalatory. I actually think that before F-16s, we need to let the tanks get there, let the Ukrainians integrate the tanks and the armored vehicles, the Bradleys and others, Bradley armored vehicles and other armored vehicles that they're getting, see what kind of offensive punch that gives them. I also actually think that something like ATACMS, so right now, the Ukrainians have HIMARS, but the missiles that we've given them have a 92-kilometer range. We do have missiles that are fired out of that launcher that can range 300 kilometers. What that would do is force the Russians to push a lot of their command and control and logistics nodes farther back from the front lines. They've already pushed most of them out of the range of HIMARS. But when you go from 92 to 300 kilometers, they would have to push much of their critical command and control and logistics back into Russia to get it out of the range of ATACMS. So I think that may actually be something that would have a more immediate effect on Russia's ability to prosecute the war than some number of F-16s.
Thank you so much, Bob. So Phil, I want to turn it over to you. We are well aware that Iran is on Russia's side here. They're arming Russia. Iranian, kamikaze drones have been seen many times. But I think, one of the biggest questions remains, what will China's role be like going forward? How that might evolve? Will China arm Russia? You and I had a really great discussion a few weeks ago where we had an FPRI event about Russia's future, and you talked about how important China is for Russia's future. What do you think China's role might be going forward in this war specifically?
Very topical question, especially as there are indications that China may now decide to be changing its policy and actually provide military aid to Russia. I mean, about a month ago, we had some reports that they were doing some of this clandestinely, kind of around the edges, not enough to make a major difference in the war. However, if China was decided to open up its armories, its ammunition dumps to China, and ship large amounts of especially 152 millimeter and 122 millimeter artillery rounds to China, or excuse me, to Russia, that would be a game changer. That could keep Russia in the war much longer and certainly allow it to use firepower where right now it's having to use bodies against Ukrainian defenses. Both sides are suffering from a shell shortage. War has many, many similarities with events that happened in World War I. So I think that would be a major, probably the best thing that China could do for Russia, the worst thing that could happen for the Ukrainians in our interest. I think we also need to examine, although this is not about China, it's interconnected, why China would do this. Economically, it wouldn't make sense. I mean, a lot of people have been touting of how much Russian-China trade has increased in the last year. And some are saying, well, this shows that we're pushing Russia into China's arms. Not likely. Russian-China trade did decrease drastically to a total of $190 billion in 2022. However, that's only 3% of China's total trade with the world. So far, it has been fearful of Western sanctions and economic blockades against its trade in case it breaks the sanctions against Russia. So this has been one of the deterrents against the Chinese. It's been an economic decision not to harm its own economy, and also then for resulting possibly domestic problems that would arise from this. What we have to look at, though, is China, although Xi has accumulated a greatest amount of power domestically than any Chinese leader since Mao, China, unlike Russia, is still run by a Politburo, which means you're going to have different views. And there may be those in the Politburo who believe that it is not in China's best political interest to have Russia lose this war, especially vis-a-vis their future intentions regarding Taiwan. It's well known that one of the arguments for us supporting Ukraine is so that future aggressors know the price they pay and that they cannot win an aggression. And the argument that is most cited and most important for US interest is China-Taiwan. Well, the Chinese understand this too. And if there are elements in the Politburo that believe that it's not in China's best interest for this to happen, because they know then opposing elements in the Politburo would use this as an argument against them, then it's in their best interest, if they do want to possibly use force against Taiwan in the future, to make sure that Russia succeeds in its use of force against Ukraine. So this is going to be a very important decision. It'll obviously have effects of what happens on the battlefield in Ukraine, but also could have ramifications of what's going to happen in the Pacific in the near future.
Thank you, Phil. John, Bob, I'm interested in your views on Russia-China relations and China's role in this war. John, let's start with you.
You know, from a defense to defense or mill to mill perspective, I think that the relationship has really been more smoke than fire over the last couple of years. We've seen that relationship, though, how can we say, become a little bit more important, I think, from the Russian perspective, particularly over the last year. And now, as we know, there are great concerns that we have about the Chinese opening up the spigots, as Phil has just outlined. I think what's held the Chinese back to this point is as Phil noted, the threat of economic sanctions on the part of both the US and the EU. I think China is very reluctant to have two of its largest economic customers in the world imposing sanctions upon it. I think the West needs to use that leverage a little more actively. We've heard, I think Secretary Blinken has been fairly blunt about that. We've heard Joseph Borrell, the EU's foreign policy chief, say that providing weapons outright or explicitly would be a red line for the EU. I think the US and the EU need to be on the same page about spelling out for the Chinese precisely what that would look like, what the response would look like. Because to date, that cooperation, as I mentioned, has been, I think, mostly for political, rhetorical purposes. But if it becomes more tangible, and there's a risk now, a high risk that it might, then we've got great things to worry about, as Phil mentioned.
Bob, what's your take on China?
I guess all I would add is, so the narrative on the Russia-China relationship, at least since 2008, has been, is it a strategic partnership or is it an axis of convenience? In other words, are they true partners and almost informal allies, the way the NATO countries are, or the way the US and the UK are, or is the only thing driving them together a shared resistance to what they label US hegemony and a desire to sort of see the US taken down a few notches? And if you pull us out of the equation, they're more likely to compete than cooperate. I think the Ukraine war is the biggest test of this question that we've seen in this century, because the fundamental question here is, I think, is China willing to incur costs on Russia's behalf? We'll have an answer to that question fairly soon. If the answer is yes, then I think you can say this is a strategic partnership, and it's not just about knocking the US down and creating a multipolar world instead of a unipolar world. If the Chinese continue to sort of sit the fence and try to have it both ways, then I think we have a different answer. Then it is more of an axis of convenience. But so I think the Ukraine war is the biggest test of the Russia-China relationship we've seen in a long time.
What is fairly soon? You mentioned we'll find out fairly soon. What do you think?
Meaning, is China willing to incur costs? I think, this.
Right.
I think we will know fairly soon whether the Chinese are shipping defense articles to Russia. And Phil mentioned the 122 and 152 millimeter artillery ammunition. That's critical because this has become an artillery war. It's become, the ironic thing is all of this talk in Russian strategy and doctrine about non-contact warfare, and on the West, our fascination with technological solutions. We're seeing a 20th century war. We're seeing a grinding, attritional industrial war where the ability to just put ordnance downrange in the direction of the enemy is a key component of victory. So the question is, do the Chinese provide the Russians what they need to continue to prosecute the war in a way that makes them more likely to be effective? If they do, we will know. And there will be, I would have to assume there will be secondary sanctions on China. China would then incur a cost for its support of Russia. And then I think the Chinese have made a decision about their relationship with Russia.
I think I'm trying to get a sort of your sense of the timeline, right? I think there are quite a few who are expecting something big to happen this spring, for example, right? So are you able to see it in those terms, or is your sort of view of the war more uncertain what might be coming within the next few months?
Well, that's a question for an intelligence professional. Luckily we have one here on the panel, so I'm not gonna, I do think it, I mean, you, Phil, I do think it would be, it's probably it's a few months at most before we know what the Chinese are doing, because if they haven't done this, if they haven't provided Russia defense articles by this spring or early summer, and the Ukrainians mount a significant counteroffensive, right? Because the fear, I think, on the Russian side, or the fear on the side of people who would like to see Russia achieve most of its objectives, is this sort of vaunted Russian winter offensive is already underway. It's been underway for a month. It's not making significant gains. There is a potential for Russia to culminate offensively, to exhaust its offensive potential right about the time where the Ukrainians are receiving and integrating all these tanks and other armored vehicles, and then allow the Ukrainians to go on a counteroffensive. If that happens, and they make significant gains, and the Chinese sort of stand back, then we have an answer, I think, about the nature of the relationship. But I think that's going to happen by late spring, early summer.
Phil, do you agree with that possible timeline?
Well, I'll take on Bob's challenge. I recognize a hand grenade with its pin pulled out when it's handed to me. If they do not do it this spring, then they may have a chance that Russia could lose this war. And on this, we've been talking about the Chinese supplies going west. I'd like to talk about our supplies going east a little. On this, I differ with Bob a little bit. I'm very concerned, and have been concerned since the beginning of this war, about the incrementalism of our aid. And incrementalism in providing aid to an ally, I believe, is a great mistake, because first off, it doesn't give your ally what they need in the quantities they need it for getting the results you want, which is, I think, should be victory. And the second thing is that it allows your enemy to be able to adapt to those supplies, those weapon systems you're giving them. I do believe, definitions may differ, but I do believe that the Ukrainians could be in a position to have military success this year, if properly equipped. I also believe that their army is large enough and their air force is large enough to be able to absorb several different weapon systems at one time. Therefore, I don't believe there should be a staging. M1s now, F-16s or A-10s or Griffin fighters later. These things can be done in parallel. This is because of the long lead time of the logistics and the training and other things it takes. Imagine where we would be right now at the end of February 2023 if these decisions had been made in June of 2022. And the problem is we need to make a definitive decision now about supplying these weapons, and then get to it with imaginative ways to deal with the inherent problems there are of providing these technically sophisticated weapon systems to another country that doesn't have that much experience of dealing with them. But the Ukrainians have already shown a great ability to adapt to NATO weapon systems, use them properly. And may I add, we don't need really to teach Ukrainians much anymore about how to beat the Russians. They're now the experts. There's a lot we can learn from them. The thing to do is make a decision and give them what they need now to get the war over, so we don't have a war of attrition. which is going to cost more lives in the long run. I just believe the old adage, I'm sure Bob's taught it many times at the War College, a good decision now is better than a perfect decision later.
Thank you very much. I have an audience question that I want to pose to John. This question comes from John de Blasio. He says, my question has to do with the desired outcome of the Allies' support. The incremental approach seems to imply that we're comfortable with achieving a stalemate, which leaves a frozen conflict on something close to equal terms. Part of this calculus seems to be that policymakers don't believe the Ukrainians really can achieve decisive victory, and part of it seems to be a fear of what comes next with respect to political change that may occur from a decisive loss, political change, I guess, whichever side loses. Can you comment on this?
Yeah, I think that American leaders at least have been pretty clear, sometimes more clear than they intended, and have had to go back and revise their remarks, that the U.S. is out to achieve a strategic defeat of the Russians. And it seems to me that not all of our European allies are on board with precisely that same outcome, or if they are, they may differ in what that looks like. We need to remember that the Europeans are a heck of a lot closer to the Russians than Americans are, and so the notion of a Russia that is politically unstable, with thousands of nuclear weapons, still a lot of latent military potential, as Bob outlined in his earlier remarks, that is that's a source of great anxiety, I think, among many in Europe. There are certainly those that see this, those allies that see this the way Washington does, and would be eager to see Russia taken down a few notches, not to implode domestically or politically, but rather to have its ability to fundamentally threaten the interests of Europe reduced in some way. And I think that is probably some common ground on which most of the allies can agree. Now, how we go about doing that, and what we provide the Ukrainians in what order, what time frame, that's of course open to continuing debate and discussion among the allies. But as I mentioned in my opening remarks, I think Europe is now really seized with the notion that we can't treat Russia the way we once did, that they are not partners in security in Europe, and that rather we have to erect a stronger defense to prepare for whatever Russia looks like post-conflict.
Thank you, John. Can you also comment on what's your reaction to, this story that Russia is pulling out of the New START treaty? I'm sure nobody's surprised, but what do you see? What do you see as the implications of that on NATO security and how Europeans perceive their nuclear security?
Yeah, this is a good question, Maya. I think there are two implications. One is sort of at the broad philosophical, theoretical level, the other at more the operational level. At this broad theoretical level, we've seen, if it comes to fruition, the demise of yet another arms control arrangement between Russia and the West. And you take this on top of the CFE, the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty, and other treaties that open skies that we are no longer implementing. It seems to me that what we're seeing is really a hit to the utility of arms control more broadly, right? I mean, these kinds of tools were very helpful at the end of the Cold War and into the 1990s, when there was more of a seeing eye to eye between Russia and the West. And when we don't see eye to eye, when there's great disagreement, these agreements really aren't very helpful, and they can't be implemented. So that's sort of a broad commentary on arms control and its utility. At the operational level, the Russians were clear to note that they were still going to abide by the limits. And so I don't think we expect to see so-called breakout of the Russians vis-a-vis the forces, the strategic forces that were limited by New START. So in that regard, I think from a security perspective, the impact will likely be fairly limited.
Thank you, John. Bob, I have a question for you from Daniel Abahazi. He says, as an expert Army foreign area officer and security cooperation practitioner, do you think the assistance provided to Ukraine since 2014 has been a major factor in the AFU's ability to counter Russian aggression? That's a great question.
So, yeah, thanks for the question, Dan. And Dan is probably better postured to answer that question than I am, given that he worked in and on Ukraine and continues to for a long time, has and continues to. I think the short answer is yes, but. So as I said in the very beginning, it's not about a few hundred javelins. A few hundred javelins were not going to allow Ukraine to survive the initial 48, 72 hours of the war had they not been used effectively. And so they were used, they were distributed, they were to small units, and they were able to be fired at tanks, Russian tanks, without commanders having to call up and ask permission. And to be honest, I think a lot of people were surprised by that. And Dan knows better than most that there was a lot of skepticism in the West about the extent to which the Ukrainian military was able to operate according to what we call in the West mission command. In other words, power and authority being delegated, commanders outlining an intent for an operation, and then letting their subordinates develop the situation according to the commander's intent. There was a lot of skepticism, but I think there were some, in the year before the war, there were some changes in high-level Ukrainian leadership, both in the Ministry of Defense and the General Staff. And you had new leaders that took this mission command type philosophy more seriously than their predecessors. And probably just in time, I had somebody who's worked in Ukraine for a long time and was in the business of helping develop Ukrainian military capability, say, had Zelensky not made those key leadership changes in the year before the war, it would have had a different outcome in the first several days. So I think, yes, the West helped, but I think we need to be careful about being overly self-congratulatory about the extent to which we help, because again, those javelins and the other Western aid that were provided between 2014 and the start of the war in February of last year would not have made enough of a difference had the Ukrainians not been able to operate and use them effectively. If I could really quickly, I want to respond to Phil's incrementalism remark, because I share the frustration, right? And I think a lot of people do. But, you know, incrementalism and lowest common denominator policymaking are a feature of the US policymaking system, not a bug, right? It's not. And bold, risk acceptant policy is exceptionally rare, you know, coming out of the US government. Phil, you've been in the interagency, you know why that is. It's just a lot of different opinions around the table, and some agencies are more risk acceptant than others. But I do think you saw, as the war went on, US acceptance, we became more tolerant of risk. We became more tolerant of giving the Ukrainians things that gave them more capability, but took longer to train them on, and were more valuable if the Ukrainian military collapsed and they fell into Russian hands. Some of these things like HIMARS and NASAMS and Patriot, you know, would be a significant get for the Russians. Once I think we realized that was unlikely, that increased our appetite to provide those types of systems.
Yeah, Bob, I hear you, and you're right. I think to a degree, part of my frustration is I'm having flashbacks to my time on the National Security Council and seeing in other situations this sort of incrementalism and how it worked, and it not worked well for our interest. I'd have to disagree that it is always the case, though. Do you take a look at the October 1973 war? President Nixon made a bold decision and had the military pull out all the stops to provide the arms necessary for Israel to survive. If you look at the Reagan era with its support of the various different anti-communist guerrilla movements, the same could be made, bold decisions. So these decisions can be made. And like I said, it's a case of a good decision now rather than a great decision later. And if the decision had been made in July, when it was already clear that the Ukrainians were not going to collapse and were clearly capable of using the weapons we've given them responsibly, I think we'd be in a better position now.
Yeah, and I think I read today, Christine Wormuth, the Secretary of the Army, said the M1s are going to take a year to get there, the 31 M1s. And this is because we're producing them. They're coming off the assembly line. They're not coming out of stocks because some of the technology, the armor in the M1, we're worried about transferring to the Ukrainians in case the Russians capture it and they understand the technology behind the armor of the tank. So again, I agree. not a lot of acceptance of risk. But, you know, I mean, on the other hand, our support for some of the South America or the Central American anti-communist guerrillas ended up people in jail after Iran-Contra. So there's a limit to which bold and risk acceptant policy, I think, is wise, because clearly the Reagan administration ended up breaking the law and people went to jail over that.
But that is definitely not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the willingness to provide SAMs, man-portable SAMs, to the various different resistance groups, which was considered very risky at the time. Yet a decision would be made. That's not the case with Iran-Contra. That's not what that was about. The other, point I'd like to make is that with the M1s, we let the Egyptians produce them, or in the Moroccan army, we let the Iraqis have them. I can guarantee you, if I was back in the business, I could steal an M1 tank from Iraq much easier than I could from Ukraine right now. So again, it's about accepting the risk, and it's about finding innovative ways to deal with this. And my experience over 31 years plus of training foreign troops is that if there's a will, there's a way, and it can certainly be done quicker and faster than most people believe. If you're willing to basically trust in your students and give them what they need, and they're in the war, it's their lives on the line, they will find a way, I assure you.
I think we can all agree that the US has been extremely overly cautious and reluctant in selling arms to Ukraine, right? Because Ukraine has been asking for help since 2014, and we refused to sell them anything until 2019 or so. So it seems like we're all paying the heavy price for that early reluctance. Phil, I have a question for you from Danny Lofton. How bad for business will Putin's errors in Ukraine and the resultant impact on the oligarchs have to become before some key oligarchs will abandon their pact of 2000 with Putin not to get involved in policy, foreign and domestic?
I don't think there's much of a threat to that, because any oligarch who decides to get involved in politics right now is going to wishing he had lived on the first floor of his apartment or his dacha. No, Putin would immediately remove anyone who tries that. What Putin's fear is that in a combination with the Siloviki, the people from the power ministries, the security services, the military, will take matters into their own hand, like I mentioned earlier, for leadership change, vice regime change. We are going to see in this year the sanctions biting harder into Russia. A lot of people have been saying, well, it's not caused Russia to collapse yet. Well, that's not been the purpose of them. It was to deny them capability to be able to fight this war more effectively, which it has done and will continue to do so. And as they continue, as Russian GDP and disposable income and all those indicators continue to get worse, then as a whole, the Russian elites, wherever they are in the system, are going to have to kind of balance just how long Russia can continue. And is it in Russia's benefit to continue this war? And hence we had a discussion last time I was on about, the possibility of internal coups against Putin and what this might look like. So I don't see individual oligarchs being a threat to him, but I do see collectively with those who Putin has tried to make scapegoats and those who see that the country cannot continue on this way, collectively being a threat to Putin and his future in power.
Thank you very much. John, I want to turn this next question over to you. It's slightly unclear, but I'm going to try to read this. Scott Hecht asks, should Ukraine win the war on the ground and politically, would US NATO propose full membership or a protectorate status? And how would that reshape global relationships similar to the outcome of the Desert Storm victory? And if I may tack on that, sort of your thoughts on NATO's enlargement, the prospects for further enlargement for NATO.
Yeah, this is a good question, Maya. It's getting a lot of attention right now because there were some stories from last week in the press about some of NATO's leading European states proposing some sort of a security guarantee to Ukraine that would fall short of full NATO membership. My sense is that's probably a non-starter for Kyiv, given what occurred with the 1994 Budapest Memorandum. But in any case, if one's view of Russia and its approach to security is that the Russians conflate their security with territory, and that is not a that's not a characteristic solely of Putinism, but rather applies to Russian history for the last couple of centuries. It seems as if Ukraine cannot both be an independent sovereign state, not in the clutches of Moscow, and not a member of NATO. Those two realities to me don't seem to be possible at the same time. So if the Ukrainians are content to be Russian satellites, that's completely up to them. But if they do not want to be Russian satellites and we remain concerned about security along NATO's eastern flank, I'm becoming someone who's increasingly looking favorably upon Ukrainian membership in NATO. And I say that as somebody who has written that, the 2008 commitment to both Ukraine and Georgia that they would eventually become members of NATO, that was a strategic error in my view. And no other country in Europe has ever gotten that kind of a promise, right? Devoid of any outcome on the part of the Ukrainians and Georgians or the states that are pursuing membership. It was completely a commitment to eventually enlarging. I think that was a mistake. Despite that, I think now we can't look at post-war European security without considering Ukraine in the alliance. Anything short of that is going to be subpar from Kyiv's perspective, but also NATO's in terms of defending the eastern flank.
And like Phil said earlier, we actually have a lot to learn from Ukraine now. We're getting to a point where we may not be able to teach Ukraine as much about defending itself from Russia as they can teach us. So it would probably be mutually beneficial. Bob, I want to turn this next question over to you really quickly. Just how seriously should we take Putin's nuclear threats? That's a question from Rolf Eastwick.
I think we took them overly seriously early in the war. And so Putin learns from this, right? He makes these nuclear threats because he knows that we are not risk acceptant in terms of this war, that he has a much higher tolerance for risk than we do. And so he makes them as a way to deter greater Western support to Ukraine, greater Western involvement in Ukraine. So I think we become a little inured to his threats and take them less seriously now. I do think that the one thing that has the potential for the Russians to cross that nuclear threshold is a Ukrainian military incursion into Crimea. Now, fortunately, I think the Ukrainians are much smarter than that, and everything that I've been hearing and reading about sort of their plan, should it come to that, would be to isolate Crimea, so drop the Kerch Strait Bridge completely, and then isolate the isthmus, at its narrowest point, demonstrate a military capability to take it, but then step back and subject it to some sort of arbitration. Because I think the Ukrainians understand that Crimea is just different to the Russians, ordinary Russians, as well as people in the Kremlin. And so that a military incursion is maybe the one thing in this war that I could see that would cause not a strategic nuclear strike, but a demonstration strike of some sort, an escalation with the implicit threat to escalate further if Ukraine does not back off a military operation in Crimea.
Thank you, Bob. So Matt Caesar asks a really good question. This is for Phil, but I'm actually going to use this as my last question to each of you. We can start with Phil, then Bob, and then John. He asks, in the likely event that there is political change in the Kremlin, how confident are you that that would actually lead to a withdrawal from Ukraine? And I think this is such a good question because, especially if you speak to Ukrainians, they will say the only way that this war is going to end is if Putin's regime ends, right? But if we flip that around and ask, well, if there is a change within Russia, is that an automatic guarantee that perhaps Ukraine will be left alone? Phil, let's start with you.
Let me answer that by going back to what Bob just said about Crimea. My estimate, because of the particular significance of Crimea to the Russians, yes, the average Russian, but also now the average Ukrainian and the expressed Ukrainian war aims, that as long as Russia holds Crimea, the Ukrainians are not going to give up on getting it back. However, if Crimea was to be recaptured by the Ukrainians, this would provide whoever would replace Putin with the ability to try and put the war behind us, to start a new approach towards Ukraine and the West, if that's what's wanted. It's the only way, because as long as Crimea is in Russian hands, no successor to Putin can be seen as losing Crimea. For there, I think, to be a final peace, Crimea has to change hands and go back to Ukrainian control. This is what I said, because otherwise you have a war of attrition, you may have an armistice, but then sooner or later you're going to have a second or a third Ukrainian war until these issues are settled. So that would be my estimate. I say Crimea and its possession is the key part of this war and is going to influence how it is settled. And with a limited amount of time, I'll leave it to my other colleagues to add their 2 cents.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. So I guess I would say a couple of things in response to the question. First of all, it's one of the most interesting and sort of disconcerting questions of the war. What happens if the Kremlin collapses, right? If it does, I think the most likely scenario is an elite split, right? The history of popular revolution in Russia is not a storied one. They usually fail and are pretty efficiently crushed. They've happened fairly often, but they've not been successful. Even the Bolshevik Revolution, the one of November 1917, was more of a coup than a revolution. So in terms of an elite split, the most interesting thing to watch right now, I think, is the split between the formal and informal security arms or security services in Russia. On the one side, you have Sergei Shoigu, the Minister of Defense, and Gerasimov, the chairman of the chief of the general staff. On the other side, you have people like Yevgeny Prigozhin, the Wagner Group leader, and Ramzan Kadyrov, the leader of Chechnya. And most interesting about this is Sergei Surovikin, who's a Russian general who was briefly, I think Phil mentioned earlier, was briefly in charge of the operation before Gerasimov replaced him. Surovikin appears to be on the Prigozhin-Kadyrov side, especially with Prigozhin. And I think they both operated together in Syria. Wagner Group, when Surovikin was the commander in Syria, Wagner Group was very present and active there. And there seems to be some sort of affinity between them that's developed from that. If you have people in the formal Russian military like Surovikin aligning themselves with the more sort of against Shoigu and Gerasimov and more with the pro-war camp, I think that's maybe the most destabilizing thing you can see happen in Russia. Then you do have the potential for an elite split. The problem is all the pressure on Putin right now is coming from the right. There's not a liberal anti-war elite camp that's vocal or even in the country anymore. So if he's replaced, I think you're more likely to see the war prosecuted more brutally and more finally than it is now.
John, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Maya. Yeah, I'll defer to Bob and to Phil on what's happening within Russia these days, but I'd also refer your audience, your viewers, to a great story in the Financial Times last week entitled "How Putin Blundered into Ukraine." It provides some good insights into the divides, such as they exist within Russian elite circles. I think my sense, looking at this from both the perspective of the Americans as well as the Europeans, is that although many in Europe would probably hope that Putin's demise would lead to a sea change in Russia's approach toward Europe, my own read of Russian history is that is wishful thinking. And that regardless of who was leading Russia, whether it's a president like Putin, a Politburo chairman, or a czar, the approach to European security, or really Russian security, is the same. And that is, namely, again, conflating security with territory, space, and control over your neighbors. I don't think that's going to change if Putin leaves. We might see a tactical adjustment in terms of the approach to the war, but its broader approach toward Ukraine and toward Europe will remain.
John, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we're out of time today. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us today. Robert Hamilton, John Denny, Phil Vasilevsky. I very much hope you'll come back and chat with me again. John, this was our first time speaking, and I thank you for your time. I hope you'll come back. I would like to thank our audience members. Excellent questions. Thank you for sending those in. Please make sure you're subscribed to our emails on fpra.org. We have a really excellent Ukraine edit that's going to go out a couple times this week. It's going to give you a summary of our our coverage of the war and our analysis. And keep coming back to our website, fpri.org. Just now on March 2nd, I'll be hosting another panel discussion about this war, but this time we'll be looking at Russia's domestic situation and how the war is impacting Russia at home. So thank you very much. Thanks to all of our speakers today, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Goodbye.